Welcome to the IRS Debt and Audit Podcast with Brian Loughrin.
Hello and welcome back to the IRS Debt and Audit Podcast with Brian Loughrin. Brian is a seasoned tax attorney based in Tampa and the founder of Tampa Tax Relief. For more than 25 years, he has helped individuals and business owners across the country resolve serious IRS problems, from audits to tax debt to cases in the U.S. tax court. I'm Evan Mack, and today we're talking about what it means when the IRS assigns a revenue officer to your case and why that usually signals a more serious stage of enforcement. Brian, sir, welcome back.
Thank you, Evan.
Awesome. So Brian, most IRS matters, begin with letters or automated collection notices. What does it mean when a case moves beyond that and a revenue officer becomes involved?
Well, I think a lot of that has to be put in the context of the time frame. I've been doing this work for a few decades, and I can tell you prior to COVID, cases tended to be assigned to revenue officers at a higher frequency than they are now. And of course, COVID changed so many things. The IRS went through literally a 4-year period, at least here in Florida, where there was no face-to-face contact with the IRS. It's 4 years. And when obviously that resumed, which would have been early 2024, things went back to quote unquote normal, but there had been a lot of staffing issue changes. And so because of the downsizing in the IRS, that's resulted in obviously fewer revenue officers, which means fewer cases being assigned to revenue officers. So in some respects, a case being assigned to a revenue officer now is usually a case that is really of a higher value in terms of the dollar amounts. That's just a kind of general rule of thumb, but not necessarily in every instance.
So Brian, in general, though, what types of tax situations lead the IRS to assign that officer rather than handling the case through its normal collection system? Is it that higher profile, or is it a random thing, or what have you seen?
I don't ever think there's random things with the IRS, just like I don't ever believe in random audits. I just don't think they have the resources to do it. And nowadays, with all the technology, algorithms, AI, all the different things involved, taxes and tax returns are basically mathematical problems by and large at their core. And so therefore, there's just not the resources to do random audits. It'd be a waste of time randomly assigning cases to revenue officers that could otherwise be resolved simply by doing something online. It's generally, if you have a situation where the balance is above $1 million, that's considered what they say is large dollar. That's going to be assigned to a revenue officer, and in many instances can only really be resolved with a revenue officer assigned. Other cases I've seen since COVID, after the 4-year break with COVID, which would have been early 2024 through 2024, there were a lot of new revenue officers, and they were being assigned cases that were much smaller balances, in many instances under $50,000, which is a lot of money, don't get me wrong, but relative to some of the debt out there, it's in a smaller range. And I think part of that was they were, learning their way or gaining experience working on what we call the smaller cases like that. But for now, if a case is assigned to a revenue officer, there can be varying reasons, obviously, as I just said, large dollar, $1 million and above. But in some cases, you might have a taxpayer that's kind of been through this on multiple occasions over a number of years, where they've had tax balances and resolved it or didn't resolve it. It kind of fell off, and then it kind of came back into the system and so forth. So regardless of the reason why, I just tell people when I talk to them, whether it's assigned to a revenue officer or not, that's totally beyond our control. We're just going to respond to the case at hand.
So how does that revenue officer's role differ from the automated IRS collection process that many taxpayers experienced earlier on?
Resolving a tax balance issue is done at one of two levels, either at what I call the national level, which is at the end of a toll-free number, or varying locations around the country, or it's handled locally. When I say locally, here in Tampa, obviously there's an IRS office. There's one in Orlando. There's one in Miami, Jacksonville, Sarasota, and so forth. So that's what I call the local level. When it's assigned to a revenue officer, it's just that. It is on one person's desk, so to speak, and they're the person that's actually working to resolve that matter and bring it to some type of formal resolution. The national level, anytime you call in, you not only are going to get a different office, but you're going to get a different person. And so it's just handled through a software interaction. So there's a stark difference there.
Once a revenue officer is assigned, though, how does that communication with the IRS usually change for the taxpayer or business owner involved?
Well, the IRS revenue officer will send a letter will almost always start with a letter to the taxpayer. And if I'm involved in a case, and I always encourage people, if you, at any time you get a situation where you want assistance, the time that I like to get involved is as quickly as possible, because once I enter an appearance on the case through a formal entry of appearance, power of attorney form, that is in the system. So when that revenue officer is assigned the case, of course, it's all computerized. It all goes to their laptop. They will see that I'm assigned to the case, or some, power of attorney is assigned. And that communication will be sent simultaneously to the taxpayer and to the representative, which is myself. And in some cases, given that some of the revenue officers I've known for a period of time, oftentimes they'll just call me and they'll say, "Hey, do you still represent so-and-so? I see you have a power of attorney. I've been assigned a case, so let's start next steps on this."
So when a revenue officer begins that reviewing the case, what kinds of financial information or records are they typically trying to understand?
Well, even before they get to that, if there are any missing tax returns, and we'll talk about individuals in this particular case rather than so much businesses, because revenue officers can be assigned to an individual personal tax balances. It can be assigned to a business tax balance, or in many cases with our clients, there's a combination of both, because most of our clients are small business owners. But it'll start with any missing tax returns, any returns that have reached a due date beyond any type of extension that they may have. That's really first and foremost what the IRS revenue officer wants to get, because that's going to give them the platform, the balances, so to speak, of what's owed or what may not be owed. If there's a return, a recent return that's unfiled, say there's some type of a refund that's due, that refund will credit against balances. So for the taxpayer, they have to get the returns done and submit it to the revenue officer, along with other financial information, which is the first part of your question was what type of information. More than anything, the IRS relies upon bank statements. People think of things like credit card statements, or maybe just individual receipts for various things. But as much as anything, it's bank statements, because bank statements are essentially really the blueprint of an individual's personal finances.
Mhm.
It's interesting that young people, really under 30, very few of them ever want to use cash. They all want to use a debit card or
Yep.
Venmo or Cash App or PayPal or whatever. And that's just, and I don't really ever see that changing as that population gets older. So if you have a situation where there's a bank statement that will track things for individuals, maybe in that 30 to 60 year range, much more so. But again, when I say bank statements, if it's somebody that uses a lot of those payment apps, like I just mentioned, Cash App, Venmo, and so forth, then those also fall under the umbrella of bank statements, at least in my opinion.
But from your experience, how can the presence of a revenue officers, affect the timeline or intensity of IRS enforcement actions?
Well, again, if a revenue officer is assigned, and I'm not thinking so much the way it was maybe even a year ago or a couple of years ago, where they had a lot of new ones kind of cutting their teeth, so to speak, on the smaller balance cases. Really now, the cases that I'm working currently with revenue officers, they're substantial balances, well past six figures, and in some cases, obviously, seven figures past. And so these revenue officers are just, they have a lot more direct action with myself and with my client obtaining the information. But also, for me, having a revenue officer assigned, one of the benefits is that I have a direct pipeline to somebody that can actually, help resolve the case, rather than calling a toll-free number or working it at the national level. So in some respects, it's easier to do it that way for me. I think it's better. But in other cases, you might have a case assigned to a revenue officer that's, let's say, somebody that's a little bit difficult to deal with. I'll leave it at that. And again, that's luck of the draw. There's no picking who you get to dance with. It's whoever the IRS assigns.
Without sharing any identifying details, can you describe a situation where a case became more complicated after a revenue officer stepped in?
I don't know if I could even say it was more complicated. I think the complication is really at the beginning, understanding exactly where things are, and making sure everything lines up with what the taxpayer thinks the situation might be, what I think it might be based upon the documents I have. So I don't know if it would ever get more complicated. In some cases, you have a pace that's a lot faster than if you're working at the national level. And in other instances, and this has happened many times over the years, cases assigned to a revenue officer, we're working as best we can to provide that information on the timelines, that they've provided and so forth. And then all of a sudden it's just nothing but crickets. You don't hear anything, you don't get a response. You've provided the documentation. And of course, like everybody else, we get busy, clients get busy and so forth, and the time goes on, and then all of a sudden I'm looking at my files and kind of tracking things, and I say, well, gosh, this is interesting. That revenue officer wanted this information by the 5th of the month, and here it is, the 5th of the next month. I haven't heard anything back, and then I'll call in, and only to find out that revenue officer has been reassigned off of this case to who knows what else. They're not going to say where they went, but suffice it to say, they no longer have the case. And their phraseology is they call it in their inventory, or as I say to my clients, on their desk. And they say, yeah, I don't have that case anymore. Now, I've had situations where revenue officers will call me and say, hey, listen, this case is being taken out of my inventory. It's going to be reassigned and so forth. But most of the time, I don't ever hear anything. So it's kind of interesting that sometimes you're working very diligently. It seems like there's all this sense of urgency, and then a great deal of time can go by. But again, it's just you're dealing with a large government agency that kind of does things their way, the way they've done it for a long time. But so long as we have provided the information that they're requesting, that I believe is necessary as well, then if the case does not get reassigned for a period of time, then that's just the way it is. But certainly I tell my clients, while that's going on, let's make sure that you're filing all the returns that you need to file and just doing the things you need to do. So when that case does end up on somebody's desk, we're going to be at a good spot.
But in many cases, the IRS, is looking closely at business operations, assets, and cash flow. What tends to matter most to them during that entire review?
Well, again, first is missing returns, getting those
Okay.
submitted as quickly and reasonably as possible. But also they're looking at the income, that really the basis of it is income. I tell people it's called the income tax because it's based upon income. And people say, well, yeah, I'm not stupid, I understand it, but you have to step back and think about it for a moment. If no income, no tax. So the
Okay.
IRS is first thing they're looking at is the income. What type of income is the taxpayer bringing in? And as we've talked in previous podcasts, the IRS will configure things generally on a monthly basis, at least in terms of resolution. So if somebody says, look, I've got this tax bill, it's whatever, it could be who knows how much, hundreds of thousands of dollars. And they'll say, I can't pay that all at once. Well, you're trying to work something out with the IRS, at least in terms of an installment agreement. They're looking at everything on a monthly basis. They kind of break it down that way. But that's, looking at that. But if you're looking at other options, such as innocent spouse or non-collectible status, uh, tiered installment agreements and so forth, there's a variation there. But they're really the number one thing they're looking at is income.
So Brian, for someone who learns that a revenue officer has been assigned to their case, what should they understand about having a tax attorney handle communication with the IRS moving forward?
Well, people will call me and say, "Listen, I've been kind of wrestling with this situation for a period of time," or in many cases, say, "I just got a letter today or yesterday in the mail from a revenue officer, Stadenko here in Tampa, or something like that." And he said, "What do I do?" And I said, "Well, let's talk about it." And I get some information, and there's a lot of times people will say, "Gosh, I like what you say, and I'm kind of leaning, maybe coming to meet with you and so forth, but I'm afraid that, gosh, if I come in there with an attorney, that it'll make me look guilty." And I say, well, I don't know about it making you look guilty, but it'll make you look like you're serious about resolving the situation.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times cases assigned to a revenue officer, or for that matter, even at the national level, but as to revenue officers, of course, there's a lot of cases where people don't get any type of representation. They try to handle it on their own, and they have the right to do that. But of that group, there's probably a percentage that, as I like to say, they're running out the back door as the revenue officers coming in the front door. In other
Right.
words, these revenue officers, I know, in just talking to them off the record at times, they'll spend a great deal of time literally chasing down people. And I don't mean physically driving out there, but just trying to find them, locate them, and so forth. And as people are just ducking them. And so when somebody comes to me, the case is assigned to a revenue officer, I reach out to that revenue officer. There's been a situation where that revenue officer has been, really pushing that taxpayer to get information, do this, do that, so forth, hurry up, and all this kind of stuff. And then I get into the case, and I reach out to the revenue officer, either leave a message or speak to them briefly, and then we don't hear anything for an extended period of time. And the clients will say, well, what's going on? How come they haven't called back? And well, I'm nervous and so forth. I said, listen, they know that they can reach us and we'll answer the phone. We'll call them back if we're not here. And so in that sense, I think it kind of is a little bit of a pressure reliever for the taxpayer and for the revenue officer, especially those that we've worked with. So again, it's a situation where the IRS knows you're taking it very seriously if you're engaging counsel, and at least that's my opinion as an attorney.
Awesome. Brian, thank you so much for your time, sir.
Thank you. And I do want to say one other thing, just as a point
Please.
of reference. I briefly touched on innocent spouse or offering compromise as well. If you have a situation where a case is assigned to a revenue officer and you're looking for a formal resolution, such as an offering compromise, which is the small percentage pay, or innocent spouse, certain actions that will take place will take that matter away from that revenue officer and put it back to the national level, because certain types of formal resolutions are only handled at the national level. So I just tell people, give a call to our office. We'll explain that to you. And it can have a little bit of a bearing on the best way to proceed. But definitely give us a call, and we'd be happy to talk to you.
Good stuff, Brian. And that's it for today's episode of the IRS Debt and Audit Podcast. To learn more about Brian Loughrin and his work helping individuals and business owners resolve serious IRS problems, visit tampataxrelief.com. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to subscribe, share it to the show, and leave a review so more people could find clear guidance when dealing with the IRS. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.